It was the silence that woke her. Not a car alarm, not the neighbors arguing, not the drip from the faulty gutter 3 floors down. Just a thick woolen silence where a small scratchy sound had been for weeks. The space outside her door felt empty in a way she could feel deep in her bones. A sudden void in the world. And that was worse than any noise. She lay there in the dark, the sheets tangled around her legs, and she just knew. He was gone. She'd been sleeping outside my door for 3 weeks, but last night she left something that made my chest ache. It always started the same way. A little after 2 in the morning. The hour when the city finally truly let its guard down. The hour when her own thoughts were loudest. She'd be lying there, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a forgotten continent. And she'd hear it. The smallest sound, a whisper against the worn-down wood of the hallway floor. A sigh, then the softest thump, as something small and tired laid itself down right against the threshold. She could picture it every night. A tiny body curling into itself, fitting into the narrow strip of space between her door and the one across the hall. A creature seeking the barest sliver of warmth or light or just proximity, something other than being entirely alone in the dark. She never saw him arrive. He was a ghost, a creature of pure shadow and sound. She'd thought about opening the door, of course she had. 100 times. Her hand would hover over the cold brass of the knob, her heart doing a nervous tap dance against her ribs. But she always stopped. What if she scared him? What if he was feral, all claws and fear? What if he wasn't even there and she was just hearing things? Finally cracking under the quiet pressure of a life that had become too small, too lonely. It was easier to just listen, to lie there in the dark and have a witness to the fact that she too was awake. They were a pair of insomniacs separated by 3 inches of pine and a universe of fear. Her name was Clara, and if you'd asked anyone in the building, they'd have said she was fine, quiet, kept to herself. The woman in 3B who worked from home doing something on a computer, who got her groceries delivered, who smiled tightly in the elevator and looked at her shoes. They didn't know the weight she carried. They didn't feel the hollowed-out space inside her that had been left behind when her mom passed 8 months ago. A quiet, drawn-out ending in a hospice room that always smelled of disinfectant and regret. After that, the world had lost its color, its sound. It had become a place of muted grays and constant low-level hums. Grief was a heavy blanket she wore everywhere, suffocating and familiar. She'd moved into this apartment to escape the memories in the old one. But you can't outrun a thing like that. It follows you. It sleeps in your bed, eats at your table, stares out from your eyes in the mirror. This apartment was her cocoon, her self-imposed isolation chamber. The living room was mostly boxes still. The only thing properly set up was her desk, a stark monument to productivity, and a single armchair by the window that looked out onto the brick wall of the adjacent building. She existed in the space between them. Work, then stare out the window, then try to sleep. Rinse, repeat. The highlight of her week was when the delivery guy would misread her name and she'd have to correct him. A tiny, meaningless human interaction that would leave her feeling oddly exhilarated and exhausted for hours. And then, he showed up. The first night, she thought it was the wind. A rustle of a stray plastic bag caught under the stairs. But it had a rhythm to it. A purpose. It was the sound of something alive. She'd frozen, mid-pour at the kitchen sink, a glass of water in her hand. Her first instinct was fear. A rat? A person? She'd tiptoed to the door, her breath held, and peered through the peephole. The hallway was dark. The single bulb at the end of the hall long since burned out and never replaced. But she saw a shift in the shadows, a deeper blackness that moved. And then, 2 pinpricks of light reflecting some distant street lamp glow from the window on the landing. Eyes. She'd jumped back, her heart hammering. She waited, pressed against the wall for a scratch, a sniff at the crack under the door, but nothing came. Just the sound of settling. A body making itself as small as possible on the cold linoleum floor. She spent the rest of the night on the other side of that door, sitting with her back against it, listening to the soft, rhythmic sound of its breathing. It was the most peaceful she'd felt in months. The next night, he was back. And the night after that. It became their ritual. She'd go to bed, read for a bit, turn out the light, and she'd wait. And like clockwork, just after 2 a.m., she'd hear the gentle pad of feet down the hall, the soft exhalation, the faint thump as he lay down, right against her door, as if he'd chosen her. Out of all the doors on the third floor, he'd picked hers. She started leaving things out. A small saucer of milk the second night. In the morning, it was untouched. But the water bowl she'd left was empty. So just water then, a creature of simple needs. The third night, she ventured a small can of tuna, the cheap kind in spring water. She placed it a few feet from her door at midnight and retreated inside, watching through the peephole. It took almost an hour, a small shadow slinking along the wall, all caution and tension. It was a kitten, a tiny, scrawny thing, all eyes and ribs and matted gray fur. He approached the tuna with the gravity of a bomb disposal expert, every muscle taut, ready to flee. He ate like he was starving, gulping it down in frantic, desperate bites, his head snapping up every few seconds to scan the darkness for threats. When he was done, he didn't run. He sat for a moment, cleaning his paws with a delicate, fastidious air. And then, to her astonishment, he walked the few steps to her door, turned in a circle 3 times and lay down. Right in his spot. His guard was down. He felt safe. Here. With her. That was the moment something in Clara's chest, something that had been frozen solid for a long, long time, gave a single, painful crack. She began to live for the nights. Her days were still gray, still quiet, but they had a new purpose. Anticipation. She'd go to the pet store 2 blocks over and spend too long looking at the cat food aisle, reading ingredients, feeling like an imposter. She bought a proper ceramic bowl, a deep blue one. She started putting out better food, little bits of wet food he'd devour. She'd listen to him eat, the sound a soft, contented scraping against the hallway floor. After he was done, he'd always come back to the door, and she'd always be there on the other side, sitting against it. She started talking to him. Whispering, really. Her voice sounded rusty from disuse. "Hey there, little guy. Rough night out there?" "I had a rough day, too." She told him about her mom. Things she'd never said out loud to another living soul. The guilt of not visiting more. The anger at the disease that stole her. The profound, deafening silence she'd left behind. She told him about her job. The mind-numbing data entry that paid the bills but shriveled her soul. She told him she was lonely. The words poured out of her in a soft, steady stream, absorbed by the wood of the door and, she hoped, by the small, listening creature on the other side. He never answered, of course, but sometimes she'd hear a shift, a quiet murp, a sigh, as if he was acknowledging her, hearing her. She learned his habits through the door. He was skittish, terrified of any other sound in the building. The slam of a door down the hall would send him fleeing, a gray blur vanishing down the stairwell. But he always came back. He had a soft, almost silent purr, a vibration she could sometimes feel more than hear through the floorboards. He liked to play with the loose thread on the hallway runner, batting at it for minutes on end. She'd watch through the peephole, her eye getting dry, a smile on her face that felt foreign and wonderful. She named him Arthur, after her mom's favorite president. It seemed fitting for a creature who was so serious, so dignified in his survival. Her world, which had shrunk to the size of her apartment, expanded to include the 18 inches of hallway on the other side of her door. It was his territory, his kingdom, and she was the silent guardian on the other side of the wall. She found herself smiling more, humming while she washed the blue ceramic bowl. The boxes in her living room started to look less like monuments to her stagnation and more like puzzles to be solved. Maybe she could unpack that one next week, see what was inside. She started dreaming of opening the door, of him walking in, not fleeing but curious, brushing against her legs, jumping onto the armchair by the window and curling up in a patch of sun. She imagined the weight of him on her bed at night, the sound of his purr filling the silent room, louder and more real than it was through the door. It was a fantasy she nurtured, a tiny, fragile flame of hope she cupped her hands around, but she was still so afraid of moving too fast, of breaking the spell. This thing they had, this wordless, door-separated friendship, was the most real connection she'd felt in years. What if she reached for more and lost it all? What if he wasn't what she dreamed he was? What if she wasn't what he needed? The fear was a cage, and she had locked herself inside it a long time ago. Arthur was just a visitor to the outside of it. Last night had been different. A storm had rolled in off the river, whipping rain against the windows, rattling the old glass in its frames. The wind howled down the chimney flue, a low, mournful sound. Clara had felt a knot of anxiety in her stomach all evening. Where did he go in the day? Did he have shelter from this? She put his food out early, but it just sat there, the gravy getting washed away by the rain blowing in through the cracks in the hallway window. She waited up. Past 2 a.m., past 3. The storm raged. No soft footsteps, no sigh, no weight against the door. The emptiness on the other side was a physical pain. She finally fell into a fitful, guilty sleep, her dreams full of searching for a small gray shadow in the pouring rain, calling a name he didn't know was his. And then, the silence woke her. The storm had passed. The world was still and soaked, and he wasn't there. The ritual was broken. Her chest felt tight. She told herself she was being ridiculous. He was a cat, a stray. He'd probably found a drier spot, a better food source. He owed her nothing. This was always going to happen. Loss was the only constant. She knew that. She knew it in her marrow, but still, she had to know. She had to see the empty spot. To make it real. She pushed herself out of bed, the floor cold under her bare feet. She padded to the door, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the knob. She took a deep breath, bracing herself for the emptiness, for the confirmation that her tiny pocket of hope had been washed away in the night. She unlocked the door, hesitated, and pulled it open. The hallway was dark and damp, smelling of wet wool and old wood. The blue ceramic bowl was there, full of rainwater-swollen kibble. And his spot was empty. Her heart sank. It was true. He was gone. She'd waited too long. She'd been too scared. The story was over before it had ever really begun. She leaned her head against the doorframe, the grief fresh and familiar. A well-worn coat she thought she'd almost taken off, and that's when she looked down. It wasn't empty. There, placed perfectly in the center of the worn spot where he always slept, was something, a small, damp, carefully placed offering, left in the night after the storm had passed. A final gift. It was a single, sodden, gray kitten mitten, so small, so still. And next to it, curled around it like a comma, was Arthur himself. He was wet, his fur plastered to his tiny body, shivering violently. But he was there. He hadn't left. He had come back. And he had brought her something. Something that made her blood run cold and her heart shatter into a million pieces. She didn't make a sound. She just sank to her knees there in the doorway, the cold from the floor seeping into her skin. Her hand went to her mouth. Her eyes filled with tears that blurred the hallway into a watery mess of shadow and shape. The tiny, still form of the kitten mitten, the shivering, exhausted body of the cat who had brought it. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning. And it was so much more terrible and so much more beautiful than she had ever imagined. You're here listening, and that means more than you know. If you feel safe in these stories, your one subscribe helps me keep this quiet little corner alive. Thank you for being part of this peaceful world. The world narrowed to the space between the doorframe, the damp, cold air of the hallway, the tiny, shivering body, the still gray offering. Clara's mind, usually a whirlwind of overthought and anxiety, went perfectly, terrifyingly blank. There was no plan, no protocol. There was only the sight in front of her, an image that would be seared into her memory forever, and a single primal instinct. Warmth. She moved slowly, so slowly, as if through deep water. Any sudden motion felt like a crime. Her breath hitched in her throat. She reached behind her, her fingers fumbling blindly on the small entryway table, never taking her eyes off of him. They found what they were searching for. The old soft Afghan her mom had knitted, the one that always smelled faintly of lavender and home. It was the most precious thing she owned. She didn't hesitate. She draped it over the threshold, creating a bridge between her sterile, safe world and his wild, wet, painful one. She knelt on her side of it, the worn wool scratchy against her knees. "Hey," she whispered, her voice a ragged thing, torn from a place deep inside she'd thought was sealed shut. "Hey, little guy. It's okay." Arthur flinched at the sound, his whole body tensing. His head, which had been tucked against his chest, lifted slightly. His eyes, usually sharp with caution, were wide and glassy with exhaustion and cold. He looked utterly defeated. He didn't try to run. He didn't have the energy. He just stared at her, shivering. A tiny engine of misery stalled out on her doorstep. Her eyes flicked to the kitten mitten. It was tiny, meant for a newborn, a pale heather gray, now dark and heavy with rainwater. It lay there, a perfect, heartbreaking punctuation mark to a sentence she didn't understand. He'd brought it. In the middle of that terrible storm, he'd gone somewhere, found this, and carried it back here. To her, why? Was it a gift? A warning? A cry for help so profound she could barely comprehend its depth? The questions could wait. The shivering could not. Very carefully, moving with a slowness that felt archaeological, she reached out. Not to touch him. Never to touch him, not yet. She reached for the Afghan. She gently took a corner of it, the dry part still on her side of the door, and she began to pull it inch by agonizing inch toward him. It was a risk. The movement might spook him. He might finally find the strength to bolt, to vanish back into the rain-soaked night, and she would never see him again. But he didn't move. He watched her, his breath coming in little ragged puffs of steam in the cold air. The blanket slid across the floor over the threshold until its edge was just a whisper away from his damp paws. She stopped. This was the line. This was as far as she could go. The rest was up to him. For a long moment, nothing happened. The building was silent around them, holding its breath. The only sound was the distant drip, drip, drip of rainwater from a broken gutter, and Arthur's own shaky, shallow breathing. Clara stayed perfectly still, her arm aching from being held out, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. Then a movement. Almost imperceptible. A slow, deliberate shift of his weight. He uncurled just a little. He stretched one front paw, the pads dark and wet, and placed it onto the soft wool of the Afghan. He paused, watching her, waiting for a trap to spring. When none did, he did it again with his other paw. It was a monumental effort. With a sigh that seemed to come from the very bottom of his soul, he dragged his entire body forward, collapsing onto the dry, soft territory of the blanket. He was now fully on her side of the doorway. He had crossed over. He buried his nose into the knit of the Afghan, sniffing deeply. He must have smelled her on it. The scent of her apartment, her laundry detergent, her skin. He must have smelled the lingering ghost of her mother's lavender. And instead of recoiling, he pushed his face deeper into it, a tiny, almost grateful motion. He curled into a tight, wet ball on the blanket, his shivering beginning to subside, encased in a warmth he had chosen to accept. Tears, hot and silent, finally spilled down Clara's cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. She just knelt there, her hand still outstretched, now empty, and she watched him. She watched the frantic rise and fall of his sides begin to slow into a more regular rhythm. She watched one ear, torn at the tip from some old battle, give a tiny involuntary twitch. This was trust. This was the most fragile, beautiful thing she had ever witnessed. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a wet, shivering cat choosing a soft blanket offered by a trembling hand. Have you ever had an animal wait for you, even when you didn't ask them to? Not for food, not for a door to be opened, but just wait, as if your presence alone was the point. Clara finally understood that now. He hadn't just been waiting for food. He'd been waiting for this moment. For the storm to be so bad that the rules had to change. For her to finally open the door. She couldn't leave him there. The hallway was still drafty, the cold air seeping in from under the exterior door at the end of the hall. The decision was made without conscious thought. Very slowly she began to pull the Afghan back, drawing it and him across the threshold and into her apartment. He lifted his head, his eyes wide again as the world changed. The light was different here, warmer. The smells were more concentrated, the scent of yesterday's coffee, the faint aroma of the lemon cleaner she used, the dusty smell of the book she still hadn't unpacked. He was inside. For the first time, he was inside her world. She pulled him just a few feet in, enough to clear the door. Then she stood, her joints protesting, and slowly, so slowly, pushed the door closed. The click of the latch engaging was the loudest sound in the universe. He flinched at the noise, but he didn't try to run. He was on his blanket in his safe space, and that seemed to be enough for now. The apartment felt different with him in it. The air itself seemed to change, charged with a new living energy. The silence was no longer empty. It was shared. Clara moved around him like he was a holy object, giving him a wide berth. She went to the bathroom and grabbed a clean, dry towel, the plushest one she owned. She approached him and from a few feet away gently tossed it so it landed near him, not on him. He sniffed it, then looked at her, a question in his eyes. "It's for you," she whispered. "If you want it," he seemed to understand. He struggled to his feet, his legs still shaky, and moved the few inches from the Afghan to the towel, kneading it with his paws before circling once and lying down again, now on the dry terry cloth. He began to lick at his damp fur, a slow, meticulous process. It was the most ordinary of actions, but to Clara, it was a miracle. He was grooming himself. In her apartment. He felt safe enough for that. She sat on the floor, her back against the wall, maybe 10 feet away from him. She pulled her knees to her chest and just watched him. She didn't try to take a picture. She didn't want to break the spell with the cold light of a phone screen. This was just for them. This raw, unrecorded pre-dawn moment. The gray light of morning began to filter through the window, painting the room in soft, monochrome tones. It revealed the dust on the television, the stacks of unopened mail, the general neglect of her life. But it also illuminated him. Arthur. In the slowly growing light, she could see the details she'd only guessed at through the peephole. The way his fur, now drying, was not just gray but etched with delicate, darker tabby stripes. The white patch on his chest shaped like a tiny, perfect crescent moon. The quiet dignity in the set of his whiskers. He was beautiful. Not in a pristine pet shop way, but in a real weathered survivor way. A map of his life was written on his body. The nicked ear, the faint scar over one eye. The lean muscle built from a life of navigating rooftops and alleyways. He finished his grooming and sat up, looking around the room with a quiet curiosity. His eyes scanned the boxes, the desk, the armchair by the window. He looked at her, really looked at her, not as a source of food or a dangerous giant, but as Clara. His gaze was calm, assessing, and then he did it. He slow blinked. It was deliberate. His eyes, those vast green-gold pools, closed slowly and opened again. A cat's kiss. The ultimate sign of trust. It was a language she knew. A language her childhood cat had spoken. It meant, "I feel safe with you." "I am not a threat," a sob caught in Clara's throat. She didn't trust her voice. So, she did the only thing she could. Sitting there 10 feet away, she looked directly into his eyes and she slow blinked back. "I feel safe with you too." It was a conversation, the most important one of her life. And it happened without a single word. The spell was broken by the sound of a garbage truck grinding its way down the street outside. Arthur's head snapped toward the window, his body tensing, his wildness returning in a flash. Clara held her breath. This was it. This was when he would panic, when he would remember he was a wild thing trapped in a box, when he would scramble for the door and demand to be let out. But he didn't. The sound passed. His muscles relaxed incrementally. He looked back at her, and then his gaze landed on the kitten Mitten. It had come in on the edge of the Afghan and now lay a few feet from him, a damp, lonely little thing. His expression changed. It wasn't fear. It was something deeper, a profound, weary sadness. He stared at it for a long time, his tail giving one single sad flick. Then he looked back at Clara, and it felt like he was trying to tell her something, trying to explain. He stood up on the towel, stretched his front legs out, his back arching in a long, luxurious stretch. Then he stepped off the towel, off the Afghan. He was on her bare floor. He took a few tentative steps, his paws making no sound on the wood. He walked not toward the door, not toward the window, but toward her. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She stayed perfectly still, not even daring to breathe. He came closer. 5 feet, 4, 3. He stopped just an arm's length away. He sat down, wrapped his tail neatly around his feet, and just looked at her. His scent reached her, a mix of damp fur, cold night air, and something else, something wild and earthy. This was the farthest he had ever been from an escape route. He was choosing to be near her. Not for food, not for shelter from the storm anymore. Just for her, very slowly, so slowly it was almost a meditation, he leaned forward. Not to rub against her. Not to sniff her. He just leaned. He shifted his weight, breaking his perfect posture, and inclined his entire body toward her by a few degrees. It was a subtle, incredible gesture. It was the physical manifestation of a slow blink. It was him saying, "I am leaning in your direction. I am choosing you." He held the pose for a moment, a living sculpture of tentative trust. Then he straightened up, turned, and with a new confidence walked over to the armchair by the window, her chair, and in one fluid motion, leaped up onto it. He circled twice, kneaded the cushion for a few seconds, and then settled down, curling into a perfect circle right in the center. He tucked his nose under his tail, let out a deep, contented sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 lonely nights, and closed his eyes. Within seconds, he was asleep. A deep, trusting, purrless sleep. The first real sleep he'd probably had in weeks. Safe from the elements, safe from predators, safe from everything. Clara didn't move for a long time. She just watched the gentle rise and fall of his sides. The early morning sun finally cleared the building next door, and a single golden beam cut through the window, landing directly on the chair, illuminating him in a spotlight of warmth. It caught the dust motes dancing in the air around him, making it look like he was sleeping in a cloud of gold. She looked from his peaceful, sleeping form to the lonely gray Mitten on the floor. The joy of his presence was instantly tempered by a cold wave of dread. The gift, the offering, it meant something. It was a piece of a puzzle she was terrified to solve. But for now, in the quiet of the morning, with Arthur sleeping in a sunbeam in her chair, the world felt soft. The heavy blanket of her grief was still there, but it felt lighter somehow, as if he had crawled underneath it with her and was helping to share the weight. She finally pushed herself up from the floor, her body stiff and cold. She walked quietly to her bedroom and retrieved her own pillow and a quilt. She came back into the living room, lay down on the floor near the chair where he slept, and pulled the quilt over herself. She wouldn't leave him alone. She would keep watch. As she drifted off to sleep on the hard floor, lulled by the sound of his quiet breathing, one thought circled in her mind, a quiet, terrifying prayer. What did you bring me, Arthur? And what am I going to have to do about it? The rhythm of their lives found a new beat, a strange and fragile cadence built around a single unspoken question. The apartment was no longer just a box of quiet grief. It was a way station, a safe harbor for a creature who seemed to be living two separate lives. And Clara was the keeper of the lighthouse, always watching, always waiting for his return. The first 2 days after the storm were a honeymoon of sorts. Arthur didn't leave. He explored the apartment with the cautious curiosity of a cartographer, mapping unknown territory. He discovered the sunbeam that traveled across the living room floor from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m., and he stationed himself in its path, his gray fur heating up until he smelled like warm dust and sunshine. He investigated the corners behind the still-packed boxes, his tail a question mark in the dim light. He learned the sound of the can opener, appearing silently at Clara's feet within seconds of the first metallic screech, though he never meowed. He was a creature of profound silence, and he slept. God, did he sleep? It was as if he was making up for a lifetime of vigilance. He slept in her chair on the afghan she'd laid out for him, and once, heart-stoppingly, on the end of her bed while she read. He'd just jumped up, circled at a respectful distance from her feet, and settled down, pinning her under the covers with the weight of his trust. She'd lain there for an hour, afraid to move, watching the gentle twitch of his paws as he dreamed, wondering what a cat who had seen so much dreamed about. He was affectionate in his own, subtle way. He never jumped on her lap. He never head-butted her hand demanding pets. His love language was proximity and the slow blink. He would sit just within reach, his back to her, and if she extended a hand, he would lean into her touch, his whole body vibrating with a purr so deep and resonant it felt like a motor starting up in the center of the earth. It was a purr that had been earned. It was the most rewarding sound Clara had ever heard. But the kitten Mitten was always there, a silent gray specter in the corner of the room. She'd picked it up after he'd fallen asleep that first morning. It was cold and damp, and holding it in her palm felt like holding a tiny, weightless heart. She'd washed it carefully with gentle soap and warm water, and now it sat on the bookshelf, a clean, dry, and utterly confounding artifact. She'd catch Arthur looking at it sometimes, his green-gold eyes fixed on it, his expression unreadable. There was no nostalgia there, no playfulness. It was a look of solemn duty. On the third day, he asked to go out. It was just after dawn. Clara was making coffee, and he came into the kitchen and sat by the apartment door. Not scratching, not meowing, just sitting, staring at the crack under it. Then he looked back at her. It was a clear, unmistakable request. Her stomach dropped. This was it, the moment she'd been dreading. He would leave, and the spell would be broken. He would remember the freedom of the streets, the call of the wild, and he would never come back. Her hand shook as she poured the coffee. She walked to the door. Her heart was a trapped bird beating against her ribs. You'll come back, right? She whispered, her voice thick. He just looked at her, his gaze steady. He slow blinked. Trust me. She unlocked the door and opened it just enough for him to slip through. He did without a backward glance, a gray shadow disappearing into the dim hallway. She closed the door and slid down to the floor. The fear, a physical ache. The apartment felt instantly, profoundly empty. The silence was back, but it was different now. It was a waiting silence. A hungry silence. She spent the day jumping at every sound, her eyes constantly darting to the door. She couldn't focus on work. She couldn't read. She just waited. The sunbeam traveled across the floor empty. The chair sat vacant. Do you think animals know when we're at our lowest? That they sense the cracks in our foundation and choose to either step around them or pour their own strange healing light into them? Because at exactly 4:17 p.m., as the afternoon light was starting to turn golden, she heard it. The softest of scratches at the door. She scrambled to open it, her heart in her throat. And there he was. A little dusty, a single burr stuck to his tail but whole. He looked up at her and trotted inside, heading directly for his water bowl. He drank for a full minute, his throat working steadily. The relief that washed over Clara was so powerful it left her weak-kneed. He'd come back. He'd chosen to come back, and then she saw it. Lying on the floor in the spot where she'd first found him on the Afghan, right in front of the door, was a new offering. Not a mitten this time. It was a feather. A small downy gray and white feather, the kind that might come from a baby bird. It was pristine, unblemished. It lay there, delicate and tragic. He had brought it back and placed it carefully on the exact same spot before coming to get a drink. Clara's blood ran cold. She walked over and picked it up. It was impossibly soft. "Arthur?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. "What is this?" "What are you doing?" He finished drinking, licked his chops, and looked at the feather in her hand. Then he looked at her, and for a terrifying second she saw something in his eyes she couldn't decipher. An intensity. A purpose. It wasn't the look of a cat bringing a dead bird as a trophy. This was different. This was reporting. He then walked over to his food bowl and began to eat with his usual quiet focus, as if he'd just put his briefcase down after a long day at the office. The pattern had begun. He left every morning just after dawn. He always returned between 4 and 5 p.m., and he always brought something, a gift, an offering, a piece of a story Clara was increasingly afraid to read. The next day, it was a length of red yarn, frayed and dirty, but meticulously coiled into a neat little circle on the welcome mat. The day after that, a single yellow dog's milk tooth, then a crumpled, silver Hershey's Kiss wrapper, carefully smoothed out. Each item was placed with deliberate care on the same sacred spot by the door. Each item was small, seemingly insignificant to anyone else. But to Clara they were chapters in a mystery novel she couldn't put down. She started a little collection on the bookshelf next to the now clean kitten Mitten. The feather, the yarn, the tooth, the wrapper, a museum of the mundane and the heartbreaking. She would examine each one for clues, her fingers tracing the edges, her mind racing. Was he bringing her treasures? Was he in some elemental cat way trying to provide for her, to contribute to the household? But the items felt wrong for that. They didn't feel like treasures. They felt like evidence. The weight of it began to press down on her. Her initial joy at his daily return was now always tempered by a low, thrumming anxiety. What would he bring today? What would it mean? She found herself watching the clock from 3 p.m. onward, her stomach a knot of dread and anticipation. The sound of his scratch at the door was no longer just a signal of his return. It was the starting pistol for a new wave of fear. She'd open the door. Her eyes would immediately drop to the floor and her heart would either sink or clench with a confusing mixture of relief and horror. She tried to follow him once. She waited until he slipped out at dawn, gave him a 30-second head start, and then crept out into the hallway in her pajamas and sneakers. The building was tomb quiet. She heard the faint scuffle of his paws on the stairs going down. She followed, her own breath loud in her ears. She made it to the ground floor and peeked out the main door just in time to see his tail disappear into the narrow, grimy alley that ran alongside their building. She followed him into the alley, the cold morning air biting through her thin pajama top. The alley was a world of overflowing dumpsters, discarded furniture, and the constant drip of air conditioning units. She saw him ahead, moving with a purpose she'd never seen in him inside the apartment. He was no longer her soft, purring companion. He was a hunter, a scout. His body was low to the ground, his ears swiveling, taking in every sound. He moved like liquid shadow, flowing over a broken chair, under a chain-link fence and into the next alley over. Within 60 seconds, she had lost him completely. He knew these streets in a way she never could. She was an amateur in his professional world. She stood there shivering and foolish, surrounded by the smell of rotting garbage and wet concrete, and felt a profound sense of defeat. His life outside was a secret he was not yet ready to share. The gifts kept coming. A bottle cap, a bright blue plastic bead, a soggy, unidentifiable piece of foil. Each one was laid at her feet like a puzzle piece. She started talking to him about it, her voice low and worried as she washed the dishes or folded laundry. "The yarn, Arthur? Where did you get the yarn?" she'd ask. He'd be sitting in the sunbeam washing a paw and would just slow blink at her. The tooth, was that hard to find? He'd stretch, his claws extending and then retracting, and yawn, showing his tiny, sharp fangs. He was a sphinx guarding a riddle that was slowly driving her mad. Her work suffered. She'd stare at her computer screen, but all she could see was the mental image of him traversing the dangerous urban jungle, his mouth carefully carrying these tiny, pathetic tokens. Why, what was the point? The love and trust were still there, solid and real in their morning and evening rituals, but it was now underscored by this constant, low-grade panic. The fear was no longer that he wouldn't come back. The fear was what he would bring back when he did. And then, 10 days after the pattern began, he broke it. It was a Tuesday. A cold, rain-spitting Tuesday that felt like it had given up on itself before it had even begun. Clara had a looming deadline, but she'd been staring at the same spreadsheet for 2 hours, her eyes constantly flicking to the clock. 3:48 p.m. Any minute now, Crumorn p.m. The rain tapped a nervous rhythm against the window. 30 p.m. The knot in her stomach tightened. He was never this late. He was a creature of impeccable routine. On p.m., the sky was already darkening to a deep, bruised purple. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at her skin. Something was wrong. He was hurt. He'd been hit by a car. He'd gotten into a fight with another cat. He'd finally decided he preferred his old life. The thoughts tumbled over each other, a chaotic waterfall of fear. She paced in front of the door, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She pressed her ear to the wood, listening for the faint sound of paws in the hall. Nothing, just the wind whining around the corner of the building. 30 p.m., full dark. She was crying now, silent, frustrated tears of fear. She couldn't lose him, not now. Not after he'd carved a place for himself in the hollow of her life. She had to go look for him. She pulled on her coat and boots, her hands shaking. She'd check the alley. She'd walk the block. She'd call for him, even though he never came to his name. She yanked the door open, ready to plunge into the cold night, and her foot almost came down on it. There on the doormat was today's offering, but he wasn't there. He hadn't brought it inside. He'd left it on the mat outside the door, as if he hadn't felt entitled to come in, or as if he'd been in too much of a hurry. It wasn't a feather, or yarn, or a bottle cap. It was a scrap of fabric, about the same size as the kitten Mitten. But this wasn't clean. This was filthy, stained with something dark that looked like mud but smelled faintly and unmistakably of iron, of blood, and it was patterned with tiny, faded rocking horses. Baby blanket. Clara's hand flew to her mouth. She stumbled back into the apartment, clutching the scrap of fabric. Her mind made a connection she had been refusing to make for weeks. The kitten Mitten. The feather from a nestling. The yarn, the tooth. The Hershey's wrapper. The bottle cap, the bead. It wasn't random. It wasn't treasure, it was an inventory. A catalog. The collected artifacts of something small. Something young. He wasn't bringing her gifts, he was bringing her clues. He was trying to show her something. Something he'd found. Or something he'd lost. And as she stood there holding the bloody scrap of fabric, the final terrible piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The gifts weren't for her. They never had been. They were relics. They were proof, and he was out there right now in the cold and the rain without her. He had led her to the edge of the truth, and now he was gone. The routine was broken. The comfortable rhythm of their days was shattered. The mystery had just become an emergency. The storm hadn't ended that night weeks ago. It had just been waiting to truly begin. The scrap of fabric burned in her hand. It wasn't just cloth. It was a cry for help. A distress signal written in a language of blood and faded rocking horses. The smell of it, Damp, earthy, metallic filled her nostrils and her stomach roiled. "Baby blanket." The words echoed in her skull, a death knell for the innocent hope she'd been clinging to. Arthur was out there. Not just out, but in trouble. He'd broken his ritual. He hadn't come inside. He'd left this evidence in on the mat and vanished. The panic that seized Clara wasn't the quiet, anxious kind she was used to. This was primal. A lightning bolt of pure adrenaline that shot through her veins, burning away the fog of grief and indecision. It left behind a single, crystalline command. Find him. She didn't think. She moved. She dropped the fabric scrap on the entryway table, an exhibit in a nightmare, and lunged for her coat. Her hands, which usually fumbled with simple tasks, were suddenly steady and sure as she zipped it up. She shoved her feet into her rain boots, not bothering with socks. The world had narrowed to a tunnel. The only thing at the end of it was Arthur. She burst out of her apartment door, leaving it swinging open behind her, the warm yellow light spilling out into the grim hallway. She didn't care. She took the stairs two at a time, her boots echoing like gunshots in the stairwell. The main door to the street groaned in protest as she shoved it open, and then the cold, wet night swallowed her whole. The rain was a fine, icy mist that immediately coated her face and hair. The street was slick and black, reflecting the hazy orange glow of the sodium vapor lights. It was utterly deserted. Which way? Which way? Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear. He always went down the alley. That was the only clue she had. She ran to the mouth of the alley beside her building. It was a canyon of darkness, smelling of wet brick and rotting garbage. "Arthur!" she yelled, her voice swallowed by the damp air. "Arthur, where are you?" Silence. Just the drip, drip, drip of water from a broken drain pipe. She plunged into the alley, her boots slipping on the uneven pavement. She pulled out her phone, fumbling with the flashlight. The beam was weak, pathetic, cutting a shaky swath through the gloom. It illuminated a discarded mattress, a pile of waterlogged cardboard, the glittering shards of a broken bottle. No cat, no sign of him. "Please," she whispered, her breath a cloud of steam. "Please, please, please." She pushed deeper, the beam of her light dancing over the walls. And then she saw it. A few feet ahead, caught on a splintered piece of wood jutting from a discarded pallet, was a single clinging tuft of gray fur. Her breath caught. She hurried forward, carefully plucking it from the wood. It was his. She knew it was his. She shone her light on the ground. The alley was mostly concrete and mud, but there, in a patch of soft dirt near the wall, was the faint, perfect impression of a cat's paw print. And next to it another. He'd come this way. She followed the trail, her light scanning the ground. The prints were sporadic, hard to track, but they led her to the end of the alley and into the next one over. This one was narrower, darker, choked with the skeletons of dead weeds and the hulking shapes of industrial dumpsters. The smell here was worse, thick with the cloying sweetness of decay and that same faint iron-like tang she'd smelled on the blanket. The paw prints vanished on the hard-packed ground. She stopped, spinning in a slow circle, the beam of her light jerking wildly. "Arthur!" she screamed, desperation cracking her voice. And then she heard it. Faint, almost swallowed by the sound of the distant traffic and the dripping rain. A sound that wasn't a meow, wasn't a yowl. It was a low, continuous guttural sound, a growl of pure, unadulterated warning. It was coming from behind the largest dumpster, the one pressed against the far brick wall. It was him. She knew it was him, and he was furious, or terrified. She crept forward, her body tensed for flight, her phone held out like a weapon. The growl grew louder, more intense. It was a sound she'd never heard him make, a sound that spoke of bared teeth and a willingness to fight to the death. It was the sound of a protector. "Arthur," she said, her voice soft now, a counterpoint to his rage. "It's me. It's Clara, I'm here." The growling stopped abruptly. There was a beat of silence. Then a different sound. A single, high, desperate meow. It wasn't his fighting meow. It was his "I'm here, where are you?" meow, the one he used when he got locked in the bathroom by accident. She rounded the corner of the dumpster, the beam of her light leading the way, and the world stopped. The scene was illuminated in the stark, unforgiving light of her phone. Arthur was there, crouched low in a defensive stance, his fur puffed out to twice its size, making him look like a terrifying gray specter. His ears were flat against his head, his teeth bared, his eyes blazing with a feral green fire. He was standing guard. Behind him, in the narrow, dank space between the dumpster and the wall, was a soggy, collapsed cardboard box. It was half filled with rainwater and stained with the same dark, muddy substance that was on the blanket scrap. And inside the box, curled together for warmth, were 4 tiny, shivering, impossibly small kittens. They were maybe 3 weeks old. Their eyes were open, blue and milky, squinted against the sudden light. They were skin and bone, their fur matted and wet. They were so still, so quiet, that her heart seized with a fresh, more profound terror. Were they even alive? And then one of them, a tiny gray tabby like Arthur, lifted its head and let out a sound. Not a mew. It was a faint, raspy peep like a struggling bird, the sound of life clinging on by a thread. Clara's hand flew to her mouth. She understood everything, all of it. The gifts hadn't been gifts. They had been a map, a desperate, painstakingly created map to this exact spot. The mitten, the feather, the yarn, the tooth, the wrapper, the bottle cap, the bead. They weren't treasures. They were pieces of this nest, artifacts of the 4 lives he had found, or perhaps of the life he had once had before he found her. He had been bringing her the evidence of their existence, one piece at a time, begging her to understand, to follow the trail. He wasn't just a stray. He was a guardian, a foster parent, a tiny, furry saint who had found these abandoned souls and taken it upon himself to keep them alive. He'd been feeding them, keeping them warm, all while maintaining his life with her. He'd been living a double life, stretched to the breaking point. The storm that night, he must have been trying to move them, to get them to safer ground, and the mitten had been torn from one of them in the process. And he had brought it to her. The most important piece of the puzzle. The growl started again, lower this time, a rumble of pure warning. He was still protecting them, from her. She was a giant and unknown variable. Very slowly, Clara knelt in the cold, filthy water. She placed her phone on the ground, aiming the beam away from his eyes, softening the light. She showed him her empty hands. "I see them," she whispered, her voice thick with tears she couldn't hold back. They streamed down her face, warm against her cold skin. "Oh, Arthur, I see them. You beautiful, brave boy. I understand now." She was trembling, great, racking shivers that had nothing to do with the cold. Her breath hitched in her chest. She was looking at a miracle. A terrible, heartbreaking miracle. This small, scarred cat had been trying to save a family all on his own. He watched her, his body still tense, but the fierce glare in his eyes was softening into something else. Something like a desperate, exhausted hope. She didn't reach for the kittens. Not yet. She reached for him. Her hand, shaking, extended through the misty air, into that small sacred space between the dumpster and the wall. She held it there, an offering. A promise. "It's okay," she breathed. "I'm here to help. You don't have to do this alone anymore. I'm here." For a long moment, nothing happened. The only sounds were the kitten's faint, ragged breathing, the drip of the rain, and the frantic beating of her own heart. He looked from her face to her hand and then back at the shivering kittens. She could see the war happening inside him. A lifetime of instinct telling him to trust no one, to fight, to run. And a newfound, fragile trust built over weeks of soft blinks and shared silence. The growling stopped. Completely. He took a step forward. Then another. He was out of his defensive crouch. He moved slowly, stiffly, every line of his body radiating a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. He had been holding this vigil for weeks. He was at the end of his strength. He walked right up to her outstretched hand. He didn't rub against it. He didn't sniff it. He just stood there for a heartbeat, and then he pressed the top of his head hard into the center of her palm. It wasn't a nuzzle. It was a transfer, a relinquishing. It was him handing over the weight of the world he'd been carrying on his small, brave shoulders. It was him saying, "They are yours now, please. Help them." A sob broke from Clara's chest. Her fingers curled, gently cupping his head, feeling the solid, real warmth of him. She could feel the fine tremors running through his body. He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing, and for the first time he truly, completely let his guard down. The protector could finally stand down. Help had arrived. He trusted her. Not just with himself, but with them. The moment hung in the air, suspended in the cold, wet darkness. It was the most profound moment of her life. This creature, this masterpiece of survival and love, had chosen her. He had led her here. He had given her his truth. And now she had to prove herself worthy of it. She slowly withdrew her hand. Arthur blinked up at her, his eyes now clear and calm. He gave one short, soft meow, and then turned and walked back to the box. He stepped inside, careful not to step on the kittens, and began to lick the smallest one, a calico, with a gentle, relentless focus. He was showing her what to do. Clara took a deep, shuddering breath, wiping her tears away with the back of her wet sleeve. The panic was gone, replaced by a fierce, burning resolve. The grief for her mother was still there, but it was no longer a hollowed-out space. It was now a foundation. She knew about loss. She knew about love. She knew about fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. She looked at the tiny, fragile lives in that ruined box. She looked at Arthur, their fierce, devoted guardian, and she knew with a certainty that settled deep into her bones that her life of quiet isolation was over. She had a family to save. She pulled her phone from her pocket, her fingers no longer shaking. She had to call for help. She needed a vet, an emergency clinic, a carrier, blankets, warmth. But first she had to get them out of the rain. She shrugged off her coat, the cold air biting through her sweater instantly. She didn't feel it. She laid the coat on the ground next to the box, creating a dry island in the filth. She looked at Arthur. "Okay," she said, her voice steady now, filled with a purpose she hadn't felt in years. "Okay, my love. Let's get you all home." The drive to the emergency vet was a blur of streetlights and rain-smeared windows. A fever dream set to the soundtrack of 4 tiny, ragged breaths and Arthur's low, constant purr, a sound that felt less like contentment and more like a mantra. A prayer he was humming into the universe to keep them all safe. Clara drove with one hand on the wheel. The other reached back into the cardboard box she'd belted into the passenger seat, her fingers gently stroking Arthur's soaked fur. He hadn't left the kittens. He was curled around them in the new dry box she'd scrambled to find, a living shield. His body heat their only furnace. The waiting room was too bright, smelling of antiseptic and quiet despair. A woman with a lethargic-looking parrot in a carrier glanced up, her eyes widening at the sight of Clara, soaked, filthy, her face streaked with tears and alley grime, cradling a cardboard box from which emanated the faintest of peeps. The triage nurse was all business, her efficiency a lifeline. She took one look inside the box at Arthur's protective glare and the shivering lumps of fur beneath him, and her professional mask slipped for just a second, revealing a heart-struck woman beneath. "Oh, honey," she breathed. "Come with me, right now." They were whisked into a back room, a sterile, cold space of stainless steel and beeping machines. The vet, a woman with kind eyes and tired lines around her mouth, worked with a quiet, grim focus. One by one, she examined the kittens. Clara held Arthur, who struggled for a moment, his eyes fixed on the table before collapsing against her chest, a tremor running through his entire body. He was watching, trusting her to let nothing bad happen. The news was a mixed bag, delivered in the soft, careful tones reserved for fragile things. They were severely dehydrated, hypothermic, and underweight. The smallest, the calico Arthur had been licking, had a respiratory infection, her breathing a worrying wet rattle. "It's touch and go," the vet said, her hand resting gently on the tiny creature. "Especially for this one. They're fighters, though. They've made it this far." She gave Arthur a long, thoughtful look. "Because of him, I'd guess. He's been keeping them alive. A guardian angel with fur and claws. They were admitted for the night. IV fluids, oxygen, warmth, round-the-clock monitoring." The bill made Clara's head spin, a number so large it felt abstract. She handed over her credit card without a second thought. She would have sold everything in her apartment for them. For him, the drive home was silent. Arthur sat on the passenger seat, staring out the window at the passing lights, unblinking. He was clean. The vet techs had gently wiped him down with a warm cloth, but he seemed smaller, deflated. The immense purpose that had filled him for weeks was gone, leaving behind a hollowed-out shell of exhaustion. When they got back to the apartment, he didn't run to his food bowl or his favorite chair. He walked to the center of the living room, where the Afghans still lay on the floor from their first night together, and he lay down, curling into a tight ball. He was asleep in seconds, a deep comatose sleep from which he didn't stir for 12 hours. Clara didn't sleep. She cleaned. She got on her hands and knees and scrubbed the spot by the door where he'd left his offerings. She rearranged the living room, moving boxes against the wall to make space. She went out at 5 a.m. to the only store open, a 24-hour drugstore, and bought every soft towel they had. She prepared a nest in the quietest, warmest corner of the bedroom, a place for them to come home to. If they came home. The next 36 hours were an agony of waiting. She called the vet every 4 hours for updates. The 3 larger kittens were responding, gaining strength, beginning to mewl for food. The little calico, whom the staff had started calling Pepper, was holding on but just barely. Arthur followed Clara from room to room, a silent gray shadow. He didn't ask to go out. He didn't bring any gifts. His entire world had shrunk to this apartment and the waiting. He would sit for hours, staring at the front door, as if he could will it to open and bring his family back to him. When the call finally came that they could be discharged, it felt like the world starting to spin again on its axis. Pepper was still weak, still needing medication and constant care, but she was fighting. She was going to fight. Bringing them home was a ceremony. Clara set up the nest of towels in the bedroom corner, with a heating pad set on low underneath. She brought the carrier inside, unlatched the door, and stepped back. Arthur was there in an instant, poking his head inside, sniffing intently. A chorus of tiny, excited peeps greeted him. He climbed halfway in, and Clara watched, her hand over her heart, as he meticulously licked each one, checking them over, counting them. He emerged, his tail held high for the first time in days, a proud, relieved father. He then stationed himself at the edge of the towel nest, lying down where he could watch them and the door, his duty resumed, but now with backup. Clara's life was suddenly joyously not her own. It was a whirlwind of 2-hour feedings with a tiny bottle, of mixing formula, of carefully administering pink liquid antibiotics, of weighing tiny bodies on a kitchen scale, and cheering at every gram gained. Her apartment was filled with the sounds of life, tiny mews, the rustle of newspapers, the sound of Arthur's contented purr as he watched over his charges. She was exhausted, often covered in kitten formula, her sleep fractured into tiny increments, and she had never been happier. The gray fog of grief was gone, burned away by the urgent, demanding light of need. She had to be present. She had to be here in this moment for them. There was no time to dwell in the past. The future was in the next feeding, the next dose of medicine, the next soft, trusting sigh from a kitten sleeping against her neck. Arthur was a different cat. The skittish, shadowy creature from the hallway was gone. In his place was a confident, serene patriarch. He helped her clean them. He taught them how to use the litter box by patiently digging in it until they got the idea. He let them climb all over him, biting his tail and ears with a patience that was nothing short of saintly. He was their mother, their father, their guardian, and their jungle gym, and he was hers. At night, when the kittens were finally asleep in their nest, he would jump up on Clara's bed. He no longer slept at a respectful distance. He would walk up the length of the bed, purring like a motorboat, and curl himself into the hollow behind her bent knees, or sometimes bravely, right next to her pillow, his head resting on the edge of it. His purr would lull her to sleep, a tangible vibration of contentment and trust. Weeks turned into a month. Pepper grew stronger, her wheeze fading, her eyes bright with mischief. The 4 of them became a riot of energy, tumbling across the living room floor, chasing feathers on a string, turning the apartment into a playground. Clara's world, which had been so silent, was now filled with a chaos of love. She'd unpacked the boxes. She'd hung pictures on the walls. The apartment was no longer a way station. It was a home. She knew she couldn't keep them all. It was a practical reality that pinched her heart. But she had already decided, without ever formally discussing it with him, that Arthur was home. He had chosen her long before she had chosen him. She found good, vetted homes for 3 of the kittens with friends of friends, people she trusted implicitly. Letting each one go was a tiny ache, but it was a good ache, a proud one. She had helped them live. She had helped Arthur complete his mission. The little calico Pepper stayed. She was the smallest, the one who had fought the hardest, and the one Arthur was most fiercely attached to. He doted on her, washing her face long after she was clean, letting her steal the choicest bits of food from his bowl. They were a family. A small, strange, chosen family. One afternoon, a few months after the storm, Clara was finally tackling the last box. It was labeled Mom's Things in her own shaky handwriting from the day she'd packed it. She'd been avoiding it. She sat on the sun-drenched living room floor, Arthur snoozing in his chair, Pepper batting at a dust mote. She took a deep breath and opened the flaps. It was an archive of a life. Photo albums, a favorite scarf that still smelled faintly of her perfume, a collection of ceramic birds she'd loved. Clara smiled through tears, remembering. It wasn't the sharp, debilitating pain it once was. It was a soft, sweet ache, a fondness for what had been. At the very bottom of the box was a smaller wooden box she remembered from her mother's bedside table. Inside were smaller treasures, her favorite rings, a lock of Clara's hair from her first haircut, a love letter from Clara's father, and there, nestled in a corner, was a single, tiny, gray kitten Mitten. Clara's breath caught. It was the match. The exact same pale heather gray, the same size, the same delicate knit. Her mother must have kept it from Clara's own infancy. A tiny, saved relic of a time long past. She held it in her palm, the weight of it immense. It was a perfect circle, a closing of a loop. Arthur's first gift, the one that had started it all, had been a cry for help for these tiny lives. And this, the match, her mother's saved treasure, felt like a blessing. An approval from beyond, a sign that love in all its forms endures. It gets lost, it gets dirty, it goes through storms, but it finds its way home. It leaves clues. It asks for help. It endures. She felt a presence beside her. Arthur had jumped down from his chair and come over. He sniffed the mitten in her hand, then looked up at her, his green-gold eyes clear and deep. He didn't look surprised. He looked satisfied, as if he'd known it was there all along, as if this had been the final piece of his plan. He leaned forward and pressed his head against her wrist, his purr resonating through the bones of her hand, through the tiny mitten, and straight into her heart. He then turned, trotted over to where Pepper was sleeping, and curled himself around her, a picture of perfect, peaceful contentment. Clara looked from the sleeping cats to the mitten in her hand, to the open box of her mother's memory. The apartment was warm, filled with light and the soft sounds of breathing. The silence was gone, but the peace remained. It was a peace that had been earned, fought for, saved. Arthur had never been astray. He had been a guide, a four-legged angel who had walked out of the darkness and into the narrow strip of light under her door, leading her not just to a box of kittens in an alley, but back to her own life. Back to the living. He had taught her that grief is not a place to live, but a passage you move through, and that sometimes the way out is by helping someone else survive. He had given her the greatest gift of all, something to care about more than her own pain. She placed the second mitten on the bookshelf next to the first. A matched set, a story completed, a life interrupted by loss now overflowing with a second chance. It was messy, it was chaotic, it was filled with cat hair and early mornings, and it was more beautiful than she could have ever imagined. You stayed till the end. Thank you. If it felt like a soft hug or a warm purr in your heart, subscribing lets me bring you more moments like this.